Following that strike now, a debate needs to open up in the trade union movement and on the left and amongst socialists about what steps we need to take next. Because Jeanette is quite right. There is a great concern amongst activists and probably amongst people in this room that what happened on the 13th of March in the minds of some trade union leaders was really an exercise in letting off steam because they felt there was no option because there was so much pressure coming from below, but they have no real intention of carrying the struggle any further, that as far as they are concerned that struggle is over. So we need to begin the debate now about what the alternatives are and what tactics should be engaged by the trade union movement and by the wider movement as well. I think though we should register the importance of the March the 13th strike. We should be sober in our analysis of it. It was not universally observed, that's the reality. There was areas that it wasn't particularly effective in, particularly in education, in NASUWT, one of the teachers' unions, their schools was not particularly effective. Various parts of the country were more patchy than others. But if you look at it in the round, it was a hugely successful strike on the day. And most importantly, it sent a very strong message to the politicians that people are waking up to what is going on in the Assembly and to the role of the politicians. It's really the first time since the beginning of the peace process where you've had strike action across a broad mass of people that has been very consciously directed at Northern Ireland political parties. Previously, the Northern Ireland parties have largely been able to hide behind the Tories or hide behind Labour and say they were responsible for everything that was wrong in society. And when workers came out onto the streets, when workers took strike action, when they fought back on things like the November 30th strike on pensions, it was very much directed at Westminster. It wasn't really directed at politicians in Northern Ireland. March the 13th changed that. There's just no question anybody who was involved in March the 13th knows that that was not the view that was held by workers who were out on strike. They were very clearly, consciously targeting the Assembly and clearly, consciously targeting the political parties in the Assembly and saying, you're responsible, you need to do something about this. Now, we have to be clear, they're not saying they need to be replaced at this stage. What they're saying is we need to put pressure on and we need to do something about this. And that is really a sea change, and we do have to recognise that it's a new political development in Northern Ireland terms. The strike crossed a whole number of public service areas. It took place in education, took place in health, civil service and TransLink. And in some areas it had a feel of almost general strike type proportions. That was the case in some areas, and it was extremely effective. You saw demonstrations and protests in a whole range of towns across Northern Ireland. They varied from maybe 50 people through to, I hear a number of variations about Belfast. People talk between 8,000 and 10,000 is probably realistic. Derry, where I was probably about 1,500. Strabane, I think it's maybe 300-400 in it. These were the sort of figures of the number of people taking part in the protests, and then obviously many, many more who were taking part in the strike action itself. There were multiple picket lines across the country. All of this was taking place, and all of this raises the idea of industrial trade unionism, the idea of fighting back, the idea of resisting the Assembly. And one of the things I think we should register as well is there was a certain linking up of young people and the trade unions. And that is very significant as well. And to be fair, it is largely credit to people in this room that actually happened. The referendum that was held in Queen's, where 87% of the Queen's students in that referendum voted to go on strike on the same day in support of the campaign against cuts, is very significant. It's a generation since that has happened. There was also a certain resonance amongst some school people in schools, where you had school students standing on picket lines alongside their teachers and classroom assistants, etc. So all of those positives were taking place during the strike. I say it was really, really significant, the events that happened. It is worth looking back very briefly at the build-up to the strike. You can't do the dot and comma in every part of the history of it, but there's always a danger that people forget the history of how you get to a point like the 13th of March. After an event like that takes place, it's as if it was an easy process. There was no struggle involved in it, there was no debate involved in it. The trade union movement just woke up one day and decided, let's do this. But that's not what happened. What really happened was, last October, the Assembly announced a budget that would have massacred public services, and there was a response by the left in the trade union movement. It wasn't a general response at that stage, it was a response by the left and the trade union movement, and that's worth thinking about as we go forward. A protest was called outside Belfast City Hall by NIPSA Broad Left. That protest was reasonably attended, maybe 100 people on it, something like that. That then fed back into the union. It was used as a lever then to galvanise NIPSA. Simultaneously, work was being done in INTO to oppose the cuts through INTO, and there was work being done in Unite. And from that, there was a spark really that lit a flame, and instead of having the usual picture of, well, here's cuts and there's nothing you can do about it, instead of that, a real campaign began to develop before Christmas with a series of public meetings, a lot of press coverage, a lot of argument and discussion with politicians, and a lot of pressure was applied. That campaign built up until Christmas and really up to the Stormont House Agreement. The Stormont House Agreement was signed, which copper fastened the greater number of the cuts, and then we were in a period of time where the unions prevaricated on how to go forward and the politicians prevaricated. There was a degree of confusion. That was overcome, and then we built towards the strike day on the 13th of March. But at each one of those critical steps, there was a debate taking place inside the unions, there was a difference of opinion within the trade unions, and these debates and differences of opinion still apply as we go forward. They are very far from being over. So that's how we got to this point. There was a question, I think, all the way through about what the cuts would actually mean. There is a bit of a question about that, because the politicians have played a reasonably cute role in this. They have said there will be 20,000 job losses, but there will be 20,000 voluntary job losses. 20,000 people will go on what is essentially an early retirement scheme. The reality is brutally different. If you work in the voluntary community sector, you're looking at 4,000 job losses in the next year. None of them are voluntary. There's no exit scheme. It's get the hell out. We're closing you down. There's no funding for you. Jeanette referred earlier to the primary school language provision. We just held a meeting with the people who are involved in that campaign, and here's the facts about primary school language provision. There are 80 staff who currently provide languages for primary school children. It's Irish, Spanish, Polish language is provided for primary school children to get them ready for, going into the rest of the world. This provision is common across England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. It takes place everywhere. The cuts proposal is that ends on the 31st of March. So what it means is the 40,000 children who currently get that education, that provision, will not get it from the 31st of March. These are the frontline cuts that the politicians said they are trying to avoid. These are frontline cuts being introduced by a party that calls itself left, and that's the level of cuts they're doing. On the issue of voluntary redundancy, every one of the tutors goes on the 31st of March, and none of it's voluntary. They are out the door, that is it. There's nothing voluntary about it. There's a question mark over whether they're even entitled to any redundancy pay, because they are in effect on 0 hours contracts in the public services. And those type of cuts that you see in the voluntary sector and you see in the primary school language areas, those are being replicated across the public services. What we said about what these cuts mean is coming to fruition. It means people will die in the health service. It means children will not get the education they need for the rest of their lives. It means people will not be able to get housing, and it means huge numbers of jobs disappear out of the Northern Ireland economy. And on top of all of that, like the politicians claim they've no choice, the Tories imposed all this. On top of all that, our politicians went and looked for a little bit of extra pain. They went and demanded that we also have corporation tax, and corporation tax means more cuts in Northern Ireland. Because every pound of corporation tax that the multinationals don't pay has to be covered instead from the Northern Ireland block grant. And they reckon the corporation tax cut for the multinationals will cost the Northern Ireland block grant 400 million a year. A huge sum of money. That's another swathe of cuts coming through in the economy. So this is the reality of the cuts we're facing. Now, comrades will have heard what was said yesterday in the Houses of Parliament. Osborne's statement on what the future economy is going to look like. Billions of pounds being taken out of the economy over the next period of time. If Osborne was to stick to his guns and apply that in Northern Ireland as well, and our politicians were willingly continued with the policy they currently have of introducing those cuts just because Osborne says so, then we are facing a whole period of time where we will see public services torn to pieces, really demolished. So that's the battle we are now in. That's the critical battle we're involved in, is really to protect the lifeblood of public services. This is not the fringes, this is not the edges that we're trying to defend now. We've got to the point where critical provision is under attack by the Tories and the Assembly. So the question then arises, well, where do we go next? What is the next steps for our movement? We have built very successfully up to the 13th of March, though taking on board all the shortfalls, all the difficulties that we have to take account of. But where do we go next? What we certainly cannot do is say 13th of March was the end of it. And Jeanette has referred to this. There is a deep anger amongst public service workers, particularly I think that civil service is a little bit different, but that in the like of education, in the like of councils, in the like of the housing executive, there's a deep anger and a feeling that we have been sold out time and time again by the unions because of November the 30th, but also because of the pay disputes this year, which in effect were trade union leaders bringing people out on strike for one day to let off a little bit of steam, and then that was it over. So you really wasted your day's pay. If the 13th of March is a repetition of that, people like Jeanette and myself will get hung from lampposts unless we become an opposition to that sort of a development taking place. So it is critical that we do oppose it. But we shouldn't doubt that some of the trade union leaders intentionally were using March the 13th to let off steam and have no intention of going any further. And we shouldn't doubt that some of the trade union leaders are not prepared to take the critical step, which is to attack the Northern Ireland Assembly and attack the Northern Ireland politicians in the mouth of an election on the 7th of May, because they are closer to the politicians than they are to their own members. They are partisans of the political parties, not partisans of the working class. So this all feeds into it. And I think that's why we need to have these discussions. The left needs to have discussions, socialists need to have discussions, and then we have to carry that into the unions and have discussions there and argue our case. We have to say, first of all, no sellout. We will not have a repetition of the past mistakes. The 13th of March cannot be the end of the fight against the cuts. We have to do more. And if you're planning any sort of a strategy, it's you don't just have one track, it's a multi-track strategy. First of all, we have to take on a campaigning mode, and that means getting information out to the public about what the cuts are actually going to mean, linking up with local campaigns, like you're going to see probably a local TransLink campaign that the whole union movement has to come in behind, but TransLink workers will go at their own speed as well. We'll have to link up with the primary school provision people, work with them to try and oppose the cuts, link up with whatever local campaigns are taking place and get information out to the public. Because so far we're still in a position where the general public perception is there's cuts, but they're at a high level and they don't know the detail and they're not really aware of it. I think as well we have to look at action short of strike action, which is things like work to rule, it's things like overtime bans, etc., etc. They are very effective tools in some areas, but in very many areas they're not. That's the reality. But where that type of action can be effective, we have to look at it. We have to look as well at local strike action in local areas. Again, for instance, TransLink, is it possible they will take strike action separately from other people? And there's no problem with that. We have to support that. But ultimately, the form of action that's going to put on the pressure that is necessary to win this campaign will be generalised strike action involving all the trade unions, all the members coming together in generalised strike with a political aim. And I think that's what we have to recognise and try and fight for. There's sort of two views at the minute. There is a view that we should be calling for the next strike day on the 5th of May, and then, which is 2 days before the election, and there's a view that we should call the next strike on the 1st of May, which is more historic, all that. It's really not a huge issue whether it's the 1st of May or whether it's the 5th of May. I think it's very good that within the trade union movement people are already calling for a new strike day to be named, and to be named now, and I think that's very important. If we send out the signal that there will be a strike day on the 1st of May or on the 5th of May, and that strike day is then very obviously seen as targeting the elections, targeting the politicians, that'll send a massive signal. We then have to build for that. We have to say, This time we want the NASUWT out and strike. This time we want more picket lines, we want more people on the protests, we want mass demonstrations, and we can build for it, and we can make a big difference and put more pressure on. But we also have to think and deal with the issue of sectarianism, the potential for a sectarian split and a sectarianisation of this movement. Because the reality of Northern Ireland, as Jeanette has already said, is that our society is permeated with sectarianism, and within the trade union movement that is reflected as well. The reality is, within the trade union leadership, there is a layer of the leadership who see themselves as closer to the sectarian parties than they are to the membership and to the working class. In general terms, there's an approach from some trade unionists of almost partnership. The idea of don't upset the politicians because we can always wheedle a little bit out of them if we don't annoy them too much. You then have other trade union leaders who are closely affiliated to individual political parties. Primarily, the problem at this stage is trade union leaders who find themselves affiliated to Sinn Féin. That is just the reality that we are now facing and the debate we're facing within the movement. But we have to put it forward to these people. We have to say clearly, it is not in the interest of the working class to find itself in the pockets of the politicians or affiliated to either sectarian camp in Northern Ireland. As soon as we do that, we will be divided and we will be smashed and we will be defeated. But to give an example of just how significant the danger is, the president of ICTU, John Douglas, who is, I think, the General Secretary of Mandate, spoke at the Sinn Féin Ardèche 2 weeks ago, 5 days before a strike happened. He was speaking at the conference of what is an employer in that strike action. He spoke at that conference, and what he said at that conference was, looking forward to the 1st of May, where there would be a meeting with Sinn Féin and presumably the trade unions, going by what was reported in the Irish Times, and at that meeting they would draw up the programme for a new republic, North and South. If you can imagine, if that fed out into the ranks of the trade unions, that fed out to workers in East Belfast and Ballymena and Coleraine, and you would just break the movement, its back would be broken straight away. Now that's a report in the Irish Times. We need to look at the detail of it. We need to see, is that factual? Is it verbatim? Is that what John Douglas actually meant? But never mind, looking at the detail. The reality is there's a greening of the trade union movement. There's far too many trade union leaders looking towards Sinn Féin and far too many of them trying to get into bed with them, so to speak. It presents a real difficulty for our movement, and it presents the possibility of division. So we have to say, under no circumstance should we be in a partnership with any of these employer organisations, which is what they are, nor should we be in any partnership with any sectarian organisation or be seen to lend any support to any of these organisations. It is critically important. But we are not saying that the trade union movement in Northern Ireland should be non-political. Because once you're non-political, you create a vacuum and you allow sectarian politics to bubble up. The trade union movement in Northern Ireland is non-political, theoretically at the minute. But what non-political means at the minute is, behind the scenes, there's deals being done with political parties. Behind the scenes, there's relationships with political parties. What we need to be saying is the trade union movement in Northern Ireland must become political, and its politics must be anti-sectarian, its politics must be class politics. It must break and be independent of the political parties and fight for socialist policies instead. That is the call that has to go out, I think, as we develop the movement against cuts. So it will be a combination of campaigning, it will be a combination of industrial action, and it will be a combination of politics. Those are the things we can build a campaign around. The last point I want to return to is this issue of young people and the work that was done in the lead up to the 13th of March. And again, I would commend people in this room for the work that was done. But I think we need to raise our sights. We need to say, if on the 1st of March or the 5th of March, it's 1st of March business, it's a year away, sounds worse than the bureaucrats. If on the 1st of May or on the 5th of May, we are on strike again, can we be in the position where there's 1,000 young people in Belfast city centre, along with the workers, with their own banners, represented arguing their position, defending their education system, defending their future, and fighting for their class. If we could do that, I think it would have a transformational effect on this movement, and it would present such a danger to Northern Ireland's political parties. It would send such reverberations through them. They would have to start listening. And I think all of those things are possible. Comrades in this room are the ones who are going to make it happen.